Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Dr. Grant Venerable joining us here. Excited he's back as our professional of the year. Always love having you, seeing you, and of course, catching up. How's everything going for you today, Doc?
Well, just getting ready for it, so it's fine.
Yeah, well, it's excited to see you. You
I'm
always
ready to go.
good. Well, you always enlighten us with
Um,
something new. So please introduce yourself to everyone, and we'll start off today's show. Excited. Thank you.
This is Grant D. Venerable II, born in Los Angeles many years ago. Attended UCLA with a chemistry major. I'm now living up in the high desert, uh, just above Palm Springs, California, uh, with sister and brother. Now we've all done many years on planet Earth and are reviewing our lives. So this is part of a review
Oh,
of my life. And I want to start with a question. I had to do a little research on Jill that you left me with,
sure.
and I knew I had the answers, but they weren't on the top of my head. We were doing uh, um, a timeline of the peoples of the world,
Yes.
and that everyone started out. I mean, people with the technologies, only people who lived close together in tribal groups as hunter-gatherer peoples, they were communicating, but there was no global communication. And people had not seen people in other parts of the world until we had ships built around the 1400s, when people from Europe would go and find trading routes to Asia. And we didn't really have the Americas yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I talked about the evolution of terminologies. What did these people call each other? And that has become greatly more complicated in today's world.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to give you the names of the people who developed physical anthropology. The physical part means
Wow.
the anthropology of how we looked, what our appearances were, what our behaviors were. And uh, so I wanted to just give you some of the great anthropologists of like the 1700s through the 1800s. And their names were uh, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. He
Wow.
was considered the father of anthropology, a German tribal individual, but he was from the 1700s. And then we have George Leclerc from France, and then Comte. Uh, uh, oh, I can't even read that, but a French count, and then Linnaeus from, I believe, Sweden, and uh, there's another man, Kurt Ottfried Müller. So those are the names behind what we know today as like maybe the five major and sub and other racial groups. These are the culprits who brought this joy of calling people by races, and we've been stuck in that ever since.
Yeah.
Uh, so, and now we've got to get through it and get over it. So there's another man who was much more advanced in his thinking. His name was Stanhope Smith. What was his first name? Don't. But he founded Hampton-Sydney College
Okay.
in Virginia, I believe. Well, he co-founded it with a man named Nathaniel Venable.
Oh,
Now, that's a coincidence
I was gonna
because
say, not a relative,
my,
is it?
my great-grandfather started life. He was owned by the Venable family that was at that time in Kentucky, and they had come from Virginia. So one of the many Venable sons was named Nathaniel, and Nathaniel founded this college. And it's but a lot of those Venables were professors and presidents of universities in Virginia and North Carolina, including the University of Virginia and the University of North Carolina. And there were a few others, but a few wandered down into Georgia. But that's another story. But it's part of my inheritance on this planet. What happened with a number of the subjugated persons who worked for these people who owned them is that if they were on decently good terms with them, that is, the people who were owned, they tended to adopt many of the ways of that family. And so it was clear that my ancestors of color were on good terms with the people who owned them. And in fact, my great grandfather named many of his 13 children after these people. So that was also a signal, a piece of evidence there. But these people who worked the fields and the kitchens and the houses for these Venables also adopted many of the careers that those Venable people had. So even though my grandfather, we don't know exactly how, but the name changed to Venerable, is inserted an ER in the middle of the word. And many of us became professors and scientists and mathematicians because that's what the Venables were. Now, jumping to where we're going to today, it's been a big week. And I was getting into some fine areas of distinction and the timeline of the development of civilization, and is the whole idea of slavery, which was probably not the best word for the English speaking world to use. But nonetheless, the Hebrew world of the prior to 2000 BCE, like 4,000 years ago, there was enslavement. If you remember the story, that came a little later in the chronology of uh, Jacob's children, namely his sons, and one of them was Joseph, his second to the youngest. And the older brothers were jealous of Joseph and his intelligence and creativity. And so they took Joseph away one day and uh, sold him to some visiting traders from Egypt. And then they told their father, Jacob, who became known as Israel, oh, well, a wild animal got Joseph. And here's his little coat that you made for him. It had blood on it. And so poor Jacob was just heartbroken. But of course, then the story goes to Egypt when the people that bought him sold him to some of the Pharaoh's household people. And he wound up in the household of the Pharaoh. Don't know which Pharaoh that was, but he did well. He got to be known as an interpreter of dreams, and he did a correct interpretation for the Pharaoh, which told them they were going to have to face a famine, and they'd have to get ready to store up grain for the year that famine would occur. And of course, the Nile Valley, the Nile River, brought famine, and it brought plentifulness in the crops. And ultimately, Joseph became what's called a ruling governor of Egypt. And then the whole story of Judaism evolved out of that. So now we come to the 1600s, the 1700s, and these new terminologies came about. So there were these people in France, and they became known as French people, the French race. They lived in France. And then there's the Belgian race, and the Polish race came from Poland. So they didn't break it down. There's just this common word to cover all of them. The English race, the Irish race. And then you had the Native American races, the tribal distinctions, and then all the way to China and Africa and South America. The um, that's where I want to get back to some of the things, my readings from my volume 1 of my memoir entitled um, um, Footprints in the Chaotic Unknown. So certainly our era where we live today in the 21st century is pretty chaotic. And so I wrote the memoir about my own development, education, my careers, but I also mentioned the development of my ancestors from as far back as the 1600s and what their careers were. That's very important information for human beings to have on one another because we live in cycles. We live in climate cycles. We live in political cycles, social cycles. So it's good for this information to be cataloged. So descendants know how their ancestors survived during difficult cycles. And I just mentioned one about the famines in Egypt that came on regular cycles. So I want to see if I can jump to this without disrupting things here. There it is. I left with a reading I was doing from volume 1 and the terms in volume 1. And one of those was Jubal and the double shadow. And I wanted to say more about the double shadow. So we're going back to Eden, where the founders of Eden are sitting there at the great table at the Garden of Eden, looking out. And they're watching the progress of Adam and Eve after they were driven out of Eden. Now, it starts here in the early 21st century. AI promised both revolution and redemption, but every revolution brings the seeds of its own destruction as well, thus revealing the double shadow in the dual human experience. And that was the rub. The surprise appearance of dualism in Adam and Eve's new awareness of their nakedness alerted the Eden Quartet, sitting at the great table, that Adam and Eve had eaten of the forbidden fruit of a certain tree of knowledge, a sure sign of life's thorny dualisms, the one in algebra called algebraic group theory, and then just plain old good and evil, light and dark, male, female, and life and death. So while their ejection from Eden was but a minor consequence of this serpent's temptation, it morphed into Homo sapiens' quest for freedom and happiness. Yet, this awareness also led to mortals' overemphasis of this tendency called us versus them tendencies in life, and the rise of narcissistic, power-crazed progeny who would suppress freedom to acquire limitless power and wealth. The Eden Quartet must be weeping over such sad intrusions into its divine creation, but already deploying corrective action. The ejection from Eden's comfort zone was but a small price to pay for a serpent's temptation, since the Eden pair's interest in learning morphed into a higher quest for freedom and the joy of learning. But time-distant progeny, smitten by unending lusts for power, darkened life's us versus them shadow, because they mistakenly observe any matter with the light of wisdom placed behind and not in front of all matters. They cannot distinguish reality from unreality or good from evil. The appearance of these ruthless mortals has threatened freedom everywhere. Now, I come to the comment about my 4-volume memoir. Illustrated work begins and ends with the Alpha and Omega first-last theme. All the text material in my memoir, in between the first and last paragraphs, describes my own journey of paradoxical crises that would have tried the patience of Job. Now, I mean that humorously, of course, but I think it would have tried the patience of Job. Yet I, the author, recognize that I've enjoyed success and joy, perhaps beyond what mortals have any right to expect. But finding inspiration from disruptive obstacles along life's paths only reinforced my resolve, creativity, and defiance of the odds in manifesting my hopes. I cite significant ancestors, kinfolk, and mentors upon whose shoulders I stood. He admits to miracles. That's me. I admit to miracles appearing out of nowhere, so it seemed, as persuasive evidence that I may be living in an enchanted time space. My motives spring from a knowledge base about life acquired by my late teenage years. This and other developments are chronicled in my memoir, Footprints in the Chaotic Unknown. My story begins with loving parents and kinfolk, and even such a blessing is by now truly an act of God. You are invited to overview the contents of Volume 1 through 4 next, and the synopses of the book's 32 chapters as signposts to what lies ahead. The mythical quartet of Eden casts in a new light the origin of today's world, as well as the why of the reader's own existence. Amazingly, the Footprints memoir offers an unexpected prequel to future elections. Sages from Pythagoras to Hypatia, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Oppenheimer have left the scene, but the media would have us believe that its polling foretells the distant future, even election results. Yet humankind's next great redemption is already a fait accompli in Eden's both and wisdom of things hoped for and evidences unseen. How timely are these fruits of Carl G. Jung's depth psychology, quantum relativity, and nature's God? Now that gets us into where Jubal came from, where the double shadow came from, and why it came. And it has to do with the question of why does God do certain things and not do other things? It also came with asking, well, why does God do tragic things to these human creatures, these poor innocent human creatures that he's created? And I realized I'm missing something. I have to extend the idea of Jubal a little further. Jubal has to cover that question, particularly if God has anything to do with Jubal, which he, she, or it may well have something to do with. So one of the big questions is, why did God allow the Nazi regime to cause the Holocaust of the Jews? And I didn't have any answers. Philosophers, scholars have argued about the why. Of course, that takes people into conversations and debates about, well, does God even exist? Or if so, then what is the nature of God? These real important questions in religion and divinity and all things of that matter. So that brings me to next things. Uh, so let me get back, I think, to more notes on um, on this.
No problem.
I think this will give uh, our listeners, and Jill, you might want to give a telephone number now for
Yep.
when people have questions, they can call
Absolutely.
in, ask some questions.
So 631-307-4010. That's 631-307-4010. The lines are now open. Go for it.
Okay, here's the deal.
Mm-hmm.
Volume 1, I call Act 1, and its title is Genesis and Coming of Age. And it contains the prequel to the whole memoir. And the prequel is entitled From Eden's Dawn to Freedom's Light, Gods, Race, and History in the AI Revolution. It has a foreword, has a prologue to Act 1. The prologue is called Mythical Lucy,
Oh.
A Life in Parallel Worlds.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is a play on the Beatles song,
Ah.
Lucy, in the Sky with Diamonds. And I take Lucy to be my great, great, great grandmother, Lucy, who was born in around 85. And I tell some stories that we know about her, about
Mm-hmm.
how she lived, what her life was about in Kentucky, and before that in Virginia.
Yeah.
It's really a different picture than what you get in very sterile sounding boring textbooks who just tell you, well, America had slaveries. America had slaves that came from Africa. America had Europeans that owned slaves that came from Africa. However, when you break it down, you get a more nuanced
Yeah.
view of what really took place. So, chapter 1, well, I mentioned something about the introduction, chakras, brainwaves, and altered states. Then chapter 1 gets into a family heritage of arts and sciences. That's the Venerable and the Scott families. Chapter 2, serial awakenings amid societal chaos. Now, we think we got chaos now. We had chaos in the 1940s, the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. So a lot of us folk who've been around a while have experience with chaos. And every time we get it on a national scale, the nation always survives. There's every reason to believe the nation is still going to survive.
Wow.
It may never surprise in the exact form we know it, but it will survive. And it may even get better. So chapter 3 is about growing up in LA's cultural Eden. That's me, how I grew up in Los Angeles, which is as near as I think any large city got to a cultural Eden among the people who lived there. It didn't mean everybody was so great, but there are enough who were very neighborly people. Chapter 4 had to do with life-changing events in my own life. The biggest life-changing event there was the premature passing of my mother at age 34. And at my age of 8, and my siblings' ages of 5 and 6. Well, that really got a lot of questions going about God and the
Mm-hmm.
intentions of God. Yet, even though I have cousins who are today in their late 90s who really got upset and angry with God for allowing their auntie, my mother, to die at such a young age. And we could ask
Wow.
how. Well, of course, there's all those medical reasons.
Yep.
Well, she had malignant hypertension. I mean, if you have hypertension, that's really the worst form of it. And and hypertension, uh, the medical world did not know too much about it. There
Mm-hmm.
was nothing on the horizon like what we now know as kidney dialysis.
Yeah.
So what this did is it, in the summer of 1950, it really was working on her kidneys and all of the fall of 1950. But that was the summer that I went to my first summer camp by myself, and I did writings on that because my parents sent me on the train from Los Angeles up north uh, to San Jose on what we called the San Joaquin Daylight Train of the Southern Pacific Railroad. And it took all day to get up to Berkeley, where my godparents picked me up and kept me there for 2 days before driving me to the summer camp in the Los Altos Hills above Palo Alto. Wow, was it beautiful in those days. The whole peninsula was filled with groves of oranges and apricots and other delicious fruits. Uh, but those have been supplanted now, long supplanted by freeways and industrial corporations, Silicon Valley companies. So that's what happened there. But it was 2 weeks of a period I shall never forget. I shall cherish as long as I live.
Wow.
One reason that I will cherish them is that the people who owned the camp, the son of the great artist Frank Duvenet, and the granddaughter of one of the great industrialists of New England, Josephine Whitney Duvenet, uh, came with a vision of how they wanted to live in California starting in the 1920s, and they bought like a couple of thousand acres in that included the hills of Los Altos, and they endowed them, put them in a state trust so that they would not be changed into more base motives. And it stayed that way. It's that way today, so that people can enjoy that beautiful scenery, the forests in Los Altos. They wanted their camp to be different. They wanted it to be the first camp in the United States, as far as anyone knew, where people, youngsters of all racial groups and religions, would be welcome, and cultures. Well, the Duvenecks were Quakers from New England. So that very much was a Quaker motive. Anyway, so there we all these little kids from ages maybe 7 up to 16 or so. And so there we were. Some of us were meeting people who didn't look like us for the first time in our lives. And we were there learning music, different religious songs and hymns, and taking hikes and watching, going into the brooks and seeing the frogs and the salamanders in the brooks of the Los Altos Hills. So anyway, that's that chapter. And I did want to be sure to, because chapter 5 is called Family Connections and
Ooh,
Formative Moments.
okay.
And a lot of interesting things happen. Also, there were changes in Eden, and it was my prelude to college. But let me just look at the formative moments when here I was riding on this daylight train, the San Joaquin Daylight, and it was an all-day journey. And I was by myself sitting with a girl who was probably 12 years of age, and I was 7, just 2 months from 8. And we had a nice conversation. Then I went to the dining car, had a nice lunch. And what happened there was a miracle. I didn't know it at the time. I didn't characterize it that way at the time. I found my way to the dining car and I was sitting by myself and I ordered the one of the wait staff came by and said, "Well, what will you have, young man?" I said, "I want a ham sandwich and a glass of milk." And that's what I agreed with my mother that I wanted to order. So my
Uh-huh.
mother gave me a $2 bill, which you don't see much anymore, to pay for the lunch. And and then in a few minutes, a lady and what appeared to be probably her grandson, maybe about 10 years old, sat down with us across from me.
Mm-hmm.
And she said hello, and she may have introduced herself, and I've forgotten her name. Now, she's what society would call a colored lady
Mm-hmm.
and her little son. And the other terminology you'd hear was a Negro lady.
Mm-hmm.
And what she was doing was carrying out a ritual that was common across the United States, particularly among that racial group. When they'd walk in and see, like, here I was, this little colored boy sitting by my lone self at a table. And so she went right to that table. And before I knew it, after she made her order of what they would eat, the wait staff brought in all of this food. It was a 5-course meal,
Mm-hmm.
starting with a soup and it started with there were rolls, hot rolls. There was a salad and a roast beef, some peas and carrots and mashed potatoes with gravy, and then a little bit of dessert. And I was so surprised, and she could see the surprise on my face. So she said, "Well, eat your food. That's for you." I said, "Oh, okay." So I ate my food, and and then they were finished. We've seen all this scenery fly by this big picture window. That was beautiful going through the San Joaquin Valley. And they left. And I had this $2 bill, but the staff never came to pick up my money.
Mm-hmm.
So I got impatient and got up out of my chair and walked into the
Yeah.
kitchen on that train. And the chef was standing up there, tall man, looked like my mother's brother, Uncle Luther. And I handed him, reached out with my $2 bill. Here's my money for the lunch. And he says, "Oh, you don't owe us anything. That nice lady paid for your lunch." And I couldn't understand that. Well, why did she do that? that. It took me years to understand. This woman was enacting a historic, traditional role played out by many elders across this country. I don't want people to think it was especially because of our race, but in that instance, it was, which I had to realize later. But you do still see that in some places when you're traveling where there's very young
Yeah.
kids. They're watched over by people they don't even know,
Yeah.
and they're looked after. So the next piece of the drama, uh, let's see, when does it come? There it is. Chapter 6 is when my stepmother comes into the family, and she marries my father back in 1953,
Mm-hmm.
and she brought her daughter into the family. And I call this Changes in Eden, Prelude to College. And so it narrates my time in junior high school and then in high school in detail in terms of who taught me, what they taught, what were the teachers like, and and then it gets into chapter 7, Angels in the Family. Well, Angels in the Family talked about people that weren't necessarily biologically relations, but they were close relations because of their role in that instant that they were with us. So that's how Aunt Annabelle came into the family. Well, she was a close friend of my grandmother, my father's mother. They attended the same AME church there in Los Angeles. And Aunt Annabelle would take care of us one day a week and wash our clothes for us and our sheets and cook a dinner for us. And she was like our fairy godmother for all of our lives until she passed away at age 90. But this, she too was enacting an old custom that was in the ethnic group of the people that we were in community with. Then there was there was a gentleman, also not biologically related, but he was related as sure as Aunt Annabelle was. He was a member, now I could use the word the way it used to be used. He was a member of the English race. At least that was his father's background, and his mother was from Ireland. His name was James Cantlin. Cantlin was in my life. I knew him because when I was student body president at Manual Arts High School in LA, they had a Boys' Day week every uh, year, and different boy politicians at each school and leaders would be chosen for a city role. So I was chosen to be president for a day of the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. Wow, what was that about? Well, I learned. And that's how I met James Catlin, because he was that president of the LA
Yeah.
Chamber. And he told me, what does the chamber do? Well, it publicizes your city all over the world because that's how commerce is stimulated. That's how business is generated for the corporations and universities of the Los Angeles area. So that's the organization of the book in terms of focusing on moments and people. By the way, I knew James Catlin for the rest of his life.
Oh,
And,
wow.
for 15 more years until he passed away at 75. He did me some very great mentoring and favors in the
Yeah.
process, which I talk about how does a corporation fund itself for new projects? A big lesson for today. Well, they go to certain banks as their venture capitalists. But anyway, if you get the book, I'll say get the book so you can read the role that Catlin played when I the Warner Brothers company owed me money for a record album cover that I designed. It was based on one of my artworks. And so that appeared on a record album of a Charles Wright's album, Here Comes the Sun. That was out, sometime in the late 60s. And I kept not getting paid, but Cantlin gave me the phone number of the chief executive officer of the Security Pacific National Bank. Go to him. And they contacted Sullivan, told me they'd like for me to have me come out to visit him. And I did. I told him what the issue was. It only took a few days. I got a call from Warner Brothers saying, go to this certain office at the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank, and your check will be ready for you. That was a good object lesson for history. So
Amazing.
that's the way that it goes here. The Angels and the Family, chapter 7, and then chapter 8 is called Altered States of Consciousness, Parallel Worlds from 1957 to 2007. Well, 57 was my graduation year from junior high school. And then 27, that was a big year for Africa. Ghana became an independent nation from England that year. And then chapter 9 was on the chapter on my experience in UCLA 11. And it goes like that. So, how are we doing so far, Jill?
We're good. No
This is
calls yet. No calls yet, but the lines are still open. 631-307-4010. That's 631-307-4010. We are good. We got another 10 minutes, Grant.
Okay, great. Chapter 2 is finishing UCLA. That's called chapter 12, From College to the Future. And then chapter 13 was how I came to start doing commissioned artwork for chemists, various places in the United States and in Europe. And then chapter 14 starts my first year in graduate school at the University of Chicago. Well, you might think that's kind of dry or boring stuff, but it was anything but dry and boring. It got into my actual drive. There were some uncomplimentary things. I'll just segue back to the past for a minute. It seemed to come up in the past week about an individual is criticizing the civil rights law of 1964, which eradicated racial segregation in restaurants and gas stations and various other public accommodations across the country. A friend of mine from UCLA and I drove together from LA to Chicago. Because of that civil rights law of 64, we didn't have any problems that people had been having. So we stopped in this little cafe in Liberal, Kansas. We were able to walk in, order our breakfast, and leave. But it did cause a sensation. I will say that. They'd never seen anyone walk in to a restaurant, that particular one. Now, picture this. A 22-year-old white guy and his friend from college, a 22-year-old black guy, sat down at a table and ate without incident, although it was an incident for some people in there. But we couldn't have done that. It would have been an enormous inconvenience to have to do other things like pack food to take with us. But anyway, that starts to get into some of the real important points of the writing. Chapter 15, chapter 14 starts my cultural adaptation to the city of Chicago, which you cannot imagine how different that city was compared to Los Angeles, where you could still park your cars on the street downtown and leave your doors unlocked.
Mm-hmm.
At Chicago, part of our orientation was don't leave your cars unlocked.
Yep.
This is the city of Chicago. And how to walk on the street and avoid problems. And it's just a different kind of city.
Mm-hmm.
And where to go and where not to go. And so then the other chapters talk about other factors of life. Some of the classes that I took, how I got through them, how I developed study processes, how I adapted to life there. One thing is I learned to swim every day, which I did at UCLA anyway. But I swam in the University of Chicago men's gym, and that's how I stayed healthy through graduate school. Um, I learned a lot about human psychology at that uh, university, that experience. And at the last chapter of the book was maybe the most interesting chapter. And all of the people that I met back there, chemists, other individuals not in chemistry. But I was there at the end of the development of the atomic bomb. That atomic bomb was developed under the bleachers of the gymnasium at the old gym of the University of Chicago. Many of my professors worked on that project. I was face to face with conversation with classmates about, well, what are the social, societal implications of the atomic bomb? Because a great quantity of the chemists and physicists and engineers that developed that frightful bomb got pangs of guilt and they left the field. They went and did other things for the peaceful use of the atom. We might not think anything of that today, but then that was a big deal. And that's when the nuclear negotiations started between nations, especially the United States and Russia. Well, we're still negotiating, as you know, with the war in Ukraine and the impact that Russia could still be having on the United States. Um, well, let's see. I think the final event of my graduate education. How many minutes we got now?
We're
About
good. We
4.
got 5 minutes. You're a 5. Don't worry.
Okay, that's good. Um, I got a glimpse of the future when I took my final oral examination to defend my thesis, my
Mm-hmm.
dissertation, the original piece of science I did. And at the end of that very difficult, very challenging oral exam given by 4 individuals. One was my research professor named Jack Albert. Another was his colleague, a young man who was an assistant professor. Another was a physics professor. And then another was an Argonne National Laboratory radiation chemist. And they really worked me over verbally. I don't mean meanly, but they asked questions. Will you derive this equation, please, Mr. Venerable? And I said, yes, do my best. But, and then they were done. It took about an hour and a half. And my professor said, well, if you would leave us now and go up the hall. And I went up the hall to his laboratory suite. And that's when your committee decides your fate.
Yeah.
That's what every graduate student, that's an exciting moment. So I went up the hall and just sat there, just staring at the laboratory equipment and just waiting. And finally, Professor Halpern came in and he offered his hand and said, "Well, congratulations, you passed." And I said, "Oh, thank goodness." So that was the long and short of it. But it meant that 10 years of college level work was completed, and the stress suddenly was off of my mind and my body. And I thought, well, I've done this. I've earned this prize now at this great
Yep.
university, and nobody can question my credentials. But they did anyway, because I lived in a world where still I carried my skin color with me right on my skin. And a lot
Hmm.
of people, unfortunately, would just assume, oh, I was just an affirmative action
Yeah.
guy or a DEI guy, and I wasn't. I did it. I earned that prize. So that's where I think I can finish this testimony.
Wow. Impressive. Well, hold
There's
on here.
still a lot of testifying going on.
There is. Go ahead. Continue. Go ahead. You still got time. Finish up. Sorry.
No, I'm that that's it. That's the extent of it. And I realized I still had other hurdles to go over, but I knew I could handle them. And that was the difference. I didn't know that when I began graduate school, but I went there to learn, and I did learn. And a lot of it was about how to get along with your professors, no matter who they are. How do you get along with your classmates? That was important as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, well, thank you so much, Grant. Venerable, let me ask you, you always have so much to say, and there's so much insight into what you're doing. And at the beginning of the show that you did mention, you moved north in California, right? You said above Palm Springs.
Right.
What is life like
So
there? So you're really with your siblings?
yes, it's totally different.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, my sister lives up the road about 2 miles, and my brother,
Aw.
we share an apartment, a beautiful desert apartment that there's about 300 units in here. There's a lovely swimming pool, and it's surrounded by desert mountains where I
Wow.
get all kinds of inspiration. So I feel I belong here, but I'm only 130 miles from Los Angeles, so it's easy to visit friends and
Aw.
relatives.
Oh. And on a daily basis, here you are doing the podcast with us once a week. What's a normal, typical day like for you now?
Oh gosh, it's I wake up with the dawn. Whenever the light comes through the window, I wake up around 6:30,
Mm-hmm.
and I do things like brush my teeth and shave and go down. The cats follow me downstairs, and I feed them, and then I drink water to hydrate, keep myself hydrated. Just as right now, I'm drinking hot my chocolate milk, and get my mind stirring. Like I have to get ready with quitting that, because I realize I'm not going to that out until just a few hours ahead of time. So it's okay. It works out better that way. And then I have to still unpack boxes. So that's going. I have to shop a little, but the pool's about to close for the winter, the fall and the winter seasons, and so that's about the size of it.
Yeah.
So
Oh.
Well, Sundays I go to my house of worship and keep my dues paid to the Creator.
Amazing. Ah, wow. Well, let's tell everyone how we can contact you, please, before we go today, Grant.
Okay. I think it's Grant D. Venerable, PhD, all lowercase .com. If it isn't Grant D, it's without a D, but it's one of those two. But it presents a rich website experience. And there are some interviews that I've taped with some other New York people on specific topics.
Oh, I'm losing you. You there?
And those are interesting, plus a timeline
There
of
we
my
go.
whole existence. Yeah,
Ah, perfect.
I'm
Sorry, we had a
still here.
good, good, good. Well, thank you again for being here. Unfortunately, we must go. We will talk again hopefully next week.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the
Okay.
rest of your day, and must be so nice being close to family. It's a lot to be said for that. And you're a man who's lived many places, who's done so much, and now living a quieter life, but still just as much, as
Right.
influential and powerful as you are.
Right.
Amazing. I want to make a move one day. I'm too scared. One day, I hope. Thank you so much, sweetheart. Enjoy your day. Bye.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.